questions from you guys before we get rolling? April, anything for you?
No. Good.
So April has, normally she is like fully engaged here, but she is on audit watch, right? Like, so they're undergoing, DOE's going through this massive audit. They want answers now, full and complete when we ask the question. So if you see her scurry to type something out, know that, you know, it's not that she's bored or not paying attention, but she's being very responsive to what she's been asked. So, anything from you guys? All right, I got 5:30. So if you're good, you feel the power? It's like the one picking up the hammer.
Welcome everyone, and as Eric said, just tonight as we're going through, this is really laying the foundation for decisions and ultimately a recommendation that we're going to be making. So please be sure to kind of ask, and if you have a question, there's probably somebody else who has the same question, just hasn't raised their hand yet to ask. So feel free to do that. Thank you to all of our guests tonight for attending, and a special welcome to this side of the table to Joycelyn, as this is her first meeting with us at the table. So not first meeting here, but first meeting. So
It's a big kids table.
yeah. All right. Take it to you.
Yeah, so we'll go around and start with introductions for the record. So Bruce, we'll start with you.
Bruce Ford, with the prime contractor for the Department of Energy. We're Four Rivers Nuclear Partnership.
April Wide, DOE.
Buzz Smith, DOE.
Lynn Combs, CAP.
Joyce on Life, but FRN.
Been Senate Chair.
Dave Brewer, Vice Chair, Tim.
Tom Barger, CAP.
Randy Gill, CAP. Eric Butterwell, CAP.
Caleb Roach, CAP.
Eric Roberts, support staff.
And we can see as our support.
Sam Burr, DEDAP.
Walter Jenkins, student.
Holly Hobson. Erin Berlin, 47. Mary and Department of Environmental Research.
So, and just that we'll get the folks online. Looks like there's several, but Marshall, Molly, and Darla are in our membership package to go forward. So they're on the cusp of being CAP members and just waiting for them. So it's good to have you guys. Thanks for being here. All right, so online, Haley, my eyes are bad, so I need your help.
We've got Julie, Brian Leonhardt, Simon Smiley, April Webb, and Victor Reeves.
Hey guys, how are you?
Doing fine, thank you.
No. Hey, at any point tonight, if you guys want to jump in, feel free. Like, want you to participate, okay, guys?
No problem. We trust Bruce. He's excellent.
Bringing endorsements. Like it. All right, so DOE comments. April?
Yeah, so just a little update, project status. We're at 176 converters segmented, 165 in storage. The site management plan for fiscal year 25 was sent out on the 13th, a couple days ahead of its regulatory due date of the 15th. And then the environmental baseline survey for the first parcel at Paducah was transmitted to the regulators, EPA in Kentucky, on November 8th. So we're making progress there with that. And then today, we hosted a tour for the ACER students. So all that's going good. And then just before we go through and then Bruce takes over, we're kind of going backwards from the last meeting a little bit, probably a little too cart before the horse, there a little bit. So we're gonna go through the circle process and then how that kind of pertains to where we're going and what we're doing, and have some more discussions on the process in selection and all that, and alternatives and different things. So that's it for me.
You said 176 converters. What was the ballpark number for like the total in the converters? Like what size?
Just in that building, it's 497.
Okay.
So
making progress.
yes.
Any questions for April? Buzz?
Only comment is, thanks to all the people that are and soon to be cab members, we appreciate you guys coming and getting engaged and being kind of ahead of the curve, so thank you. And welcome, Joyce.
Okay. Any questions for Buzz? That's a crap. All right, liaison comments. Victor, anything from EPA?
No, nothing to report at this point. Thank you.
How about from Kentucky?
I have nothing for Marion either.
Smooth and easy at this point. All right. So, April, before we move over to Bruce, anything you wanna say leading into this, or?
No, I mean, I pretty much said it, you know, that we're gonna do this overview of kind of the process. It's been a while since we went through CERCLA process and just kind of, I think maybe our last document may have been, 400 or Southwest Twin or something, so it's been a little bit. So it's a good refresher. I know we got a lot of new folks, so it's good, to kind of get the basis of how the process works, before we just jump into, you know, what we're doing, so that's about it.
If you catch Bruce using an acronym, he will give you $5.
Need the ruler.
That's on the record.
Make him keep his hand down, smacking at the ruler, because it's hard to live in the world of acronyms.
And the presentation just got way more interesting.
Just started. Sweat intentional.
Exactly. Right.
Okay. So a couple of things before we get started, because those are really high expectations. I'm not going to talk about what, like Decision 2029, how we're going to streamline what we're doing and all of that. That will be in future presentations. This is really, as Eric said, really the process that we were required to use and how we use that process. And there will be a lot of acronyms, I promise. The other thing, is there any way you can jump to the very last slide right away? And in hindsight, maybe I should have had the last slide as the first slide. I just want to point out, and as we go through this, I'll explain exactly what this means, and I am going to use acronyms. But you will see that our FFA managers, Federal Facility Agreement managers, are. I'm letting you do this so I don't make a fool of myself trying to flip it. So I want to. We'll end up back at this slide, but let's start here. So our FFA managers, essentially the decision makers that get together, at least on a monthly basis, they work together on a weekly, daily basis, often are designated under our federal facility agreement. It's in writing. It's not just hey, you're it. It's an official designation with responsibilities. But they include for DOE, April Ladd, Victor Weeks with EPA, and April Webb with Kentucky. So there is a reason that we refer to them, or Eric specifically called out to them. So we go back to the start. So with that, we'll get started. And I'm not sure I have enough $5 when we go to this first slide. So, and the whole point of this slide is to provide a little bit of confusion.
Just make mid-20s.
Okay.
Pretty easy to get involved.
Okay. There are a lot of regulations that impact the Paducah site activities. There's a lot of regulations in some of you have more than others in your world as well. I mean, we all have speed limits that impact us all on a daily basis. But we've got all of these regulations. I'm not going to go through and quiz anybody, but with the exception of gay and married, does anybody at this front table know what CAA or CWA stands for?
Only because I've looked at the next page.
Okay.
So that would be cheating, so I'm not going to take $5.
Okay. So let's just go to the next page and I'll talk about what all these are. And this is not everything. So a lot of the regulations, and I'm giving you an overview, and then we're going to zoom in on the first one up here. So Atomic Energy Act impacts some of the things that we do. It's driven a lot more in the past, in the history, but a lot of the operations and things. Clean Water Act, our surface water discharges and other things. We have permits under the Clean Water Act for those activities. Clean Air Act, anything that we emit to the atmosphere, we have permits for that, falls under Clean Air Act. Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, I'll say the acronym. TSCA, as it's commonly known, that's typically most things that have PCBs in them would fall under TSCA. Our electrical transformers and switch yards and other places would fall under TSCA for the most part. RCRA, or the Resource Conservation Recovery Act. I don't know if you've ever heard the term from cradle to grave for hazardous waste. That's what this does. So a lot of the manufacturing facilities, such as Calvert City, they operate under a lot of the RCRA regulations because they generate chemical products that they can ship, and as part of generating those products, they also generate some hazardous waste. And that will impact us later. I'll talk about RCRA as we go through this at different points. And then I threw in just a couple of things here, hazardous waste and solid waste. There are a huge amount of regulations under RCRA, and we rely pretty heavily on those regulations. And then CERCLA is what we're primarily going to talk about tonight, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. So what is CERCLA? CERCLA, as it's spelled out here, is also known as Superfund. Probably most of you, if you've not heard of CERCLA, you've at least heard of Superfund in some way, shape, or form. Was enacted by Congress in December of 1980. It was signed December 11th of 1980. Does anybody know who the president was that signed it? Nuclear engineer. Great. Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter signed it. So this is going back several years. It's been around for a while. Provided broad federal authorities to respond directly to releases or threatened releases of hazardous substances that may endanger the public health or the environment. It established prohibitions and requirements concerning flows and abandoned hazardous waste sites. Provided liability of persons responsible at those sites. Established a trust fund, and that's where the term Superfund came from, focus on fund, and enabled revision of the National Contingency Plan, which established the National Priorities List. I'll talk about that in a second. I know for the younger folks in the room, you may not be very familiar with Love's Canal in New York, but things such as Love's Canal, it was an area where a chemical company tried to develop some land and do some things. There had been chemical waste that had been dumped in this area. The surface, over time, things looked fine. Somebody decided they purchased the land for $1 or whatever, but they purchased the land. They tried to put a housing development in it. They did put a housing development in, basements, etc. And over time, the basements started to seep these chemicals. They started to realize how people were having health effects, headaches, other serious health issues. That was kind of the thing that started this legislation to deal with things like that. I'm not trying to give anybody, but some industrial areas, New Jersey, large cities, the suburbs outside of the cities where there were a lot of manufacturing, and maybe somebody went bankrupt or they walked away from the nastiness that they left behind. That's really what this was intended to do. And the way it was written was essentially EPA would perform the cleanups. And over time, if they could find a potentially responsible party, non-government typically, then they could go after those potentially responsible parties or companies that left the nasty stuff behind or were responsible for it. And there's a lot of legislation tied to that. We won't go into that. But Back here at the end, the National Contingency Plan, it's actually the National Oil and Hazardous Substances Contingency Plan. It has to do with cleanup of different things across the U.S. It established what we call the National Priorities List. The National Priorities List, there's an evaluation and scoring system to evaluate the impacts of a hazardous waste site to the local public environment, et cetera. And there's a scoring system. And if you fall above a certain level in that scoring system, then you can be placed on Superfund. If you score below that, then there may be other mechanisms to force a cleanup, such as a state Superfund, depending on where it's located. And then after the first 6 years of CERCLA, they amended it under the Superfund Amendments and Reauthorization Act. This is one of the easier acronyms to say, Sarah. It's easy to remember. In 1986, and I'll go through some of the things here that it made CERCLA better, if you will. It stressed the importance of permanent remedies and innovative treatment technologies. Rather than trying to do a full-blown cleanup, there are interim things that can be put in place to protect the public when you think about these really nasty hazardous waste things. Required Superfund actions to consider standards and requirements and regulations found in other state environmental laws. RCRA that I mentioned earlier, for the chemical manufacturers, a lot of the regulations under RCRA, we live by those regulations under CERCLA or under Superfund, if you will. Provided new enforcement authorities and settlement tools. They learned a lot in that first 6 years as they started going after the Loves Canal and sites like that. It increased state involvement throughout the program, increased the focus on human health problems, encourage greater citizen participation. This is a key thing that we will talk about. Key participation in making decisions on how sites should be cleaned up. This Citizens Advisory Board or site-specific advisory board, if you will, there's one for each of the DOE sites, as you all know, across the complex. That's primarily because of this, or a sister to what this required for the Superfund sites. So this is a direct impact on us being able to tonight. And Sarah also increased the size of the trust fund that was for fund financed cleanups. And we are not we'll say it this way, the Paducah site is not an uncontrolled hazardous waste site. There's a lot of controls, which you all will hear. It's not fund financed. It's still financed by the government, by the Department of Energy, of course, but it's not coming directly from EPA. EPA is not the lead. Here, DOE is the lead, but EPA, Kentucky, not involved. So we're going to jump. So that's generic. That's not necessarily specific to Paducah. That's nationwide. That's the act coming out of DC. So let's talk a little bit about Paducah specifically and how that rolls in. So why do we have an FFA? The FFA acronym. FFA is I should have spelled that out, but it's the Federal Facilities Agreement. Oh, here it is. Took a while before we spelled that out, but it's the Federal Facility Agreement. It's a tri-party agreement between DOE, US EPA, Bridget 4, and which is Victor is with, and Kentucky Department of Waste Management, which is in April and Sumter. In 1994, you probably know, in 1988, they discovered the contamination offsite in residential wells, and things happened very quickly after that. I know this seems later, but there were a lot of actions that occurred between that discovery in 1988 and then actually signing or actually being placed on the national priorities list in 94. So don't think that it was all red tape during that time. It's not. But the plant was placed on the NPL in 94. We have an FFA because federal facilities on the NPL are required to enter into interagency agreements. So DoD sites, Army, Navy, Air Force sites, things like that, the bases, They all have federal facility agreements, the DOE facilities, et cetera. In 1998, DOE entered into this FFA with EPA in Kentucky. As you can see here, I mentioned the roles. DOE is the lead agency. They are responsible for the cleanup. EPA provides regulatory oversight, and if for our FFA, if there's something that they disagree on, and usually it's maybe a regulatory aspect or something like that that they want to hash out, that if they go to a dispute, and that's a tool, it's not a lawsuit or anything like that, it's purely a tool at their disposal to raise it through the chain of command. For the FFA, EPA, as the lead regulatory oversight agency, has the final dispute resolution authority. So the EPA Region 4 Administrator in Atlanta has the final say if it were to get to that person's level. And typically, it's resolved. We've had disputes in the past to work things out, and it's generally resolved at a much lower level. And then Kentucky also provides regulatory oversight, and they also ensure that we comply. Said we would come back to RCRA at different points in this presentation. They also ensure that we're complying with RCRA or some of those other regulations. And one thing that I didn't show on the acronyms at the start is that this is primarily for the cleanup of the site. In addition to those other regulations, we also have permitted facilities. Like I said, the Clean Air Act, we have an air permit. We also have the operating landfill north of the site. That's permitted through the state of Kentucky. And they have we're not cleaning up the landfill, we're operating the landfill, and Kentucky has the regulatory oversight on it. As an example. This is a figure that was in an older CAB meeting presentation, and it's essentially showing that within everything that we're doing, the things that we've turned about, it includes USAC turnover to DOE, that eventually we're headed toward cleanup. In this NPL listing up here, when I said because we're a Superfund site, scored a certain level, we're on the national priorities list. Eventually, once everything is cleaned up, we got the plan is that we would be delisted. Now there will probably be some areas that may never be delisted, but a lot of the property, once it is cleaned up, would be delisted. FFA applicability and scope. Talking about, again, this is not for operation of the landfill as an example. This is the process for cleanup, making decisions for the cleanup of the plant as a whole. The federal facility agreement is surplus. Again, areas with potential or known releases of hazardous substances. The scope of surplus hazardous substances is very broad. It includes, but is not limited to, RCRA hazardous waste decisions and radionuclides. So examples, that's a lot of words there, but what that basically means, examples of surplus hazardous substances that we have out there, are TCE, PCB in some areas, uranium and technetium-99 is radionuclides, and we have some heavy metals out there, as well as the asbestos. And there's other contaminants that are documented in that version. So what I want to show is that DOE does not make cleanup decisions and evaluations in a vacuum. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to focus for a little bit on the things that happen early on in the project before they actually go to the field and start implementing the corrective action action. Okay, so how do we get to cleanup? So there are different types of circular response actions. Just jump to the next slide for a section, and I'll come back to this flow chart. So there's multiple types of circular response actions. There are remedial actions, and these are typically the bigger cleanups, longer time frame. You can see this third step bullet. examples would be capping of the landfill, our groundwater treatment systems, excavation and disposal of contaminated soil, treatment, et cetera. So remedial actions are the big ones. They're more dollars and they take more time to implement, but they're more robust in what they're cleaning up. And then there can be removal actions. These are typically shorter term in duration. There may be some cost limitations for it to be considered a removal action. Typically a greater sense of urgency. When we say removal, don't think that necessarily means that you're picking something up and removing it from the site. The removal action, in East St. Louis, there was a creek near the old Monsanto facility that was near the Mississippi River, Sauget area. One of their cleanup actions, one of their removal actions, if you will, very quickly was to keep the local kids, people, dogs, pets, etc., out of this highly contaminated creek because it had some really, really nasty stuff in it. So what they did was essentially put up a fence, a chain link fence, basically to cut off the pathway. That was a quick and dirty because they didn't have the money or the time to come in and actually clean up the creek. It was we need to keep people away from these people and animals right now. So, and then they would come in later with a longer term remedial action. So that's just an example. So like I said, removal actions, greater sense of urgency. It's not intended to be a final remedial action. It's if someone were to take a removal action, one of the shorter term actions, there would be a remedial action that would come along behind it in the future that would do the real cleanup. And here's some examples of, I already gave you an example, but just ahead, but providing drinking water to residents. When we discovered the contamination in 1988, off-site residential wells, that was the first thing they did was get those people away, prevent them from using that water for showering, for drinking, for cooking, etc. DOE provided bottled water and eventually laid water lines with West McCracken Water District at the time. It's now part of Paducah Water. So all of those homes out there are provided water from a treated system, the potable water system.
But you don't have time to really go through the full the circular process. They need water.
Yes, yeah. So
Opportunity to go there. Yeah.
under the removal, that would have been considered an emergency or a time critical. You can see the timing here with I think one of the time critical removal action to provide the water to prevent the use of that water. So there's different types of removals. We don't necessarily need to get into that, but just trying to show that there is a framework and regulations for magnitude so it can be scaled to as needed.
And it can be responsive. You know, you discover this problem, you don't wait, study a procedure, and do something, but you
Right.
give people water.
Right. We don't have to collect samples and run them through laboratories and do studies and without anything. So good point. We can go back one. So I talked about removal actions. These are the documents that we would go through. This would the action memo would be the decision. This is the agreement between the three FFA parties, DOE, EPA, and Kentucky, of what the action would be for the removal. Same process, it's just a little thicker, if you will, where this is intended to be fast, can be very fast. But on the remedial action side, we would do the remedial investigation, which is the sampling, the characterization. We look for nature and extent of the contamination. Feasibility study, we're going to talk more about this. The feasibility study is the evaluation of what can we do to clean up that unit or that area of that contamination. Talk a little bit more about that, more the process on specific examples. And then we go through proposed plan, the record of decision, similar to the action memo over here. The record of decision is the document that the three FFA parties literally sign off on and agree that this is what we're doing, this is how we're moving forward. I'll talk a little bit more about the proposed plan. It goes out to the public intentionally. Talk about public participation requirements under CERCLA. the proposed plan, if the feasibility study is 200 or 500 pages of technical stuff and rationale, et cetera, proposed plan is intended to be less than 50, probably anywhere from 8 to 20 pages of something that the public, the general public, can understand as they read through it and help them to understand why a particular decision was made. Following the proposed plan, issuance of the proposed plan, there's literally a public comment period. We would keep those open for 45 days. If there's a request for a public meeting, then we'll hold a public meeting. But that 45-day period is literally to allow the public to review that proposed plan. If they need more information, this is available to them, and I'll explain how all of that documentation is available, and they can provide comments. And there are certainly examples. There's an example in Oak Ridge of where the public comments literally changed, well, actually Calvert City, public comments changed what the cleanup remedy, the original cleanup remedy would have been. So the public has a big role. And then over here, after everyone agrees in the action memo, then you implement, DOE implements the removal action or the cleanup. Over here, after that record of decision is signed and agreed upon, then DOE moves forward with design of the larger action, whatever that may be, and implementation of the action. And in all cases, it's not shown on this graphic, but after the actions are complete, whether it's a removal or remedial action, there is documentation that either a removal action completion report or remedial action completion report that explains what occurred for the record. That this was done, and these were the results. It was planned this way. If it turned out slightly different, that's documented as well, because the real world things don't always go as planned, but it's all documented.
You know, remedial action results in a removal action. Like I say, during the investigative period, they found something more urgent. Or is there like a different avenue that
Yes.
go down?
Yeah, it's very possible that, I don't think we have an example of Paducah, but they could be investigating a particular area and they find buried drums, and just textbook example, but maybe they find buried drums or something, and different contaminants that they did not expect or they weren't looking for, depending on how bad that might be. There could be a removal action implemented. Yeah.
So, Bruce, real quick, this is like the formal structured plan with an intentional public comment period at the proposed plan, right? And so, with the CAP, with DOE continually talking with economic development, the elected officials, and like they're in continual discussion and negotiation, continual discussion with lots of parties, right? Which is why Victor and Bruce and April and the folks with Kentucky have asked for CAB recommendations on siting early in the process, right? Because by the time you get to the proposed plan, Bruce's team has put in hours and hours, if not months on months of work and planning for them to show up. This is what we're going to do, and for the group to say, yeah, that doesn't work for us, right? So it's a lot easier to get critical input earlier in the process, even though it's not part of the quote-unquote formal CERCLA cycle. But incorporating that process that they put in earlier is what we're intentionally trying to do here, so that when we get to the proposed plan, everybody's already looked at it, knows what's coming, and has agreed to it, and is pretty comfortable with it. Does that make sense? So that's why we're kind of,
And that's a very good point. And even, I know they're being very quiet, but Victor Leaks and April Webb, they don't want to see DOE get to that point and the public say, oh my gosh, I can't believe that you're proposing something like that at that location. They don't want to see that.
So we just fantastic. They say, like beta testing.
it's like, yeah, like it's kind of, and then it's similar to building a house. Like, at some point you want to, I want to check with my wife and say, what do we want this to look like,
So we'll do, that's a good example. We'll do scoping with the regulators early on in this process. It's not shown as something that's formal. It is a requirement. that we will scope with them. And like Eric said, using that example with the house, we'll scope with them. Okay, is this intended to be a 1 bedroom, 1 bath, or is it intended to be a 4 bedroom, whatever, 4.5 bath, whatever kind of thing. So we're all trying to move things along with some agreements or make sure that we're all on the same page and not have anybody surprised. There's a lot of, April would shake her head, yes, there's a lot of communication between Yankee, Kentucky, and throughout. And then the CAD meetings and other methodologies to get into we do all the coverage this week.
Sandra, mayor, judge.
So part of the chamber, part of the local elected officials, actually went to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, saw some cleanup facilities down there and met with some of their counterparts in Oak Ridge to get some feedback. So that would fall under public participation to make sure everyone's involved. Okay, so I'm not as, I don't expect anybody to really digest what this is, but if we go back to that feasibility study, where we take the information from the field, what we know as far as the types of contaminants, how big of an area, is it soil contamination, groundwater contamination, is it deep, is it shallow, is it a building, etc. When we perform that feasibility study, there are a lot of criteria and guidelines for performing the feasibility study. And what I'm trying to show is that there are requirements, there's methodology. DOE doesn't just go behind closed doors or even with the regulatory agencies and say, okay, what variables should we evaluate? What do you know, where do we want to go with this? Now, I'll say from experience, people like to say, well, I think the cleanup in that area should be this or that or whatever. Everybody kind of has their own idea. But we go through a methodical process. We're required to go through a methodical process to identify different types of cleanup alternatives or options, if you would. And there are requirements in CERCLA as far as looking at things that are relatively simple and looking at things that, you know, maybe one way to clean it up is to excavate it. We also need to look at perhaps in situ treatment of some sort of biological breakdown or something like that. And CERCLA requires that we look at a range or evaluate a range of alternatives to look at kind of essentially the bang for the buck, if you will. How complex is it? What's it going to cost? But how clean are you going to get that area using this technology? So the purpose of this slide is that we have the 9 criteria for the detailed analysis of those alternatives. So we go through that each and every time it's required. If we didn't do that, chances are DOE would be open to lawsuits because they didn't follow the process. So they're broken into 3 major categories. There's threshold criteria, and I'll read this: overall protection of human health and the environment, and the compliance with ARARs. ARARs, I don't have that acronym spelled out, sorry. It's applicable or relevant and appropriate requirements. And what it basically means, back to that RCRA regulation again, essentially do the RCRA regulations, those TSCA, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, are there regulations outside of CERCLA that EPA imposes on us for wherever they're applicable? Do any of those apply? And are we following those, or can we follow those? So the reason those are called threshold criteria, we have to comply with those. We can get a waiver from an ARR. That's seldom done, and it's only in certain circumstances. It has to have EPA Kentucky approval. But in general, 99% of the time, you have to comply with these. There's no wiggle room. The balancing criteria, so that's a given. What we call balancing criteria are really the variable factors. These are the only things that we really get to, from a technical standpoint, regulatory standpoint, that we get to used to consider the different alternatives. So there's long-term effectiveness and permanence. That's essentially, once it's cleaned up, if you really cleaned it up, how clean is it? Do you have to have deed restrictions on it because you left some degree of contamination behind, or is it clean and somebody could build a house on it? So that's long term. Reduction of toxicity, mobility, or volume. This is kind of, did you treat it? Did you leave something behind? Type of thing. Short-term effectiveness is essentially the very first one, your protection of the community during remediation, workers, environmental impacts. If we dig something up and we ship it out west to one of the radioactive disposal facilities, what kind of risks are there that we could have a transportation accident, whether it's a rail car, truck on a highway, etc. So short-term effectiveness is during the remedial action, long-term is after it's cleaned up or completed. Implementability means, can you construct it? Can you physically do it? Do you have the equipment? Is the equipment or the resources available, etc.? And then cost. A lot of people, if we ask them, okay, what do we base our cleanup decisions on? How much money you have, and do you have that? That's not the case. Cost is only one of these five. And EPA, when the CERCLA was written, and the EPA has continued to uphold this. Some people in the past have tried to put a scoring. Well, this is most important, so it's worth 10 on a sliding scale. And this is what, et cetera. And that has never worked, and it's generally been shot down every time that it's been tried. So all of these are equal, if you will. So cost is important, but it's not the number one. And then modifying criteria, state support agency or state acceptance and community acceptance. Again, back to the Sarah amendments, and community acceptance is a requirement for in-state acceptance as well for our evaluations and the decisions that people make. So again, not so much the details, but the framework, all of we have to make our decisions and evaluations using this framework.
One thing on cost too, you say, how much does your house cost? Cost also factors in the operating and maintenance costs. And so, if you have it for 40 years and it costs $5 million a year for that time frame, that's factored in as well. So it's all in cost evaluation when cost is looked at.
Yeah, so it's not just what's it cost today or next year, it's what does it cost for the next 30 plus years to maintain. Again, is there a fence? Is there a deed restriction? Do we have to have routine surveys for removing flags, etc.? So, good point, people. Circular remedial action process, it's just a different graphic, but to kind of orient you. Again, instead of going top to bottom, it's left to right. This is an old graphic from a previous CAD presentation. RIFS report, proposed plan, public participation, that 45-day review, and then record of decision, which is the agreement among the three agencies. And this is just showing the regulatory process. Here it says public comment 45 days, meeting will be held if requested. But the reason we kept this slide is this public participation down here. So ongoing site visits and project briefings with the CAB. The public meeting following approval of the final RIFS report, which is under the proposed plan. Ongoing project briefings with CAB. CAB may provide formal comments, either collectively as the CAB or as individual members of the community to do that. And then record of decision, again. And one thing I didn't mention on the record of decision, I mentioned after the proposed plan goes to the public, but the record of decision takes that public input in the final record of decision. There's a thing called a responsiveness summary, and that addresses or summarizes the comment. It's all documented. The comments from the public go into the record, into the decision. Here's some key schedule requirements. Again, the public comment period, under, for the 30 days that I keep mentioning, the 45 days under CERCLA. Consultation with regulatory agencies is required within 10 days of that proposed plan public comment period. The record of decision due to the regulators within 30 days of the close of the public comment period. So if we get 200 comments from the public on one of our proposed plans, I mean, we can take an extension if that's granted, but that doesn't mean that we can take 2 years to work through it and deal with it. Once you start that process, there are requirements to keep things time.
That is what this kind of like at the very start, bring everybody together.
Yes. Yeah. It's, yeah. We publish a notice about the final rod. And one thing, these are requirements driven by CERCLA and our FFA up here. This last one, that's a statutory requirement. Once that record of decision is signed, the responsible parties have 15 months to start the field work, and it has to be continuous field work. So nobody can game the system and go out and move a 5-gallon bucket of dirt and say we started. It has to be, and DOE doesn't do that. I mean, everything is in earnest here. With some of those non-federal government type sites, there are requirements for all of the sites. Once you start the work, you have to start the work within 15 months, but you have to keep that work going.
What if funding gets cut?
There are provisions in the federal facility agreement. There are budget letters that DOE sends to the EPA in Kentucky every year that talks about priorities, the budget that comes from Congress for the environmental management, DOE's cleanup program. So all of that is reported back to the EPA in Kentucky. And if there are issues with that, funding limitations or budget limitations, then that's the EPA in Kentucky are being aware of that.
Yeah, we put it in a letter saying that we have impact or we don't, or, like, if we did one that was kind of that way whenever we were going through the C400 feasibility study, that, you could see what these requirements are going to start within 15 months. Well, we just kind of talked about on the budget cycle, it's a 3-year out, right? So you don't know necessarily what alternative is going to be selected and how much that's going to cost, and then you can't really budget for it until, that budget cycle comes around. And so, with the C400 feasibility, it was like, hey, if one of these alternatives gets selected, we may have to, stretch it out a little longer so we can request the money that's needed to complete it or whatnot. But, so all that, we usually send letters back and forth and have discussions about it, depending on how much is available.
You gotta realize EPA in Kentucky are federal and state agencies as well. And sometimes they have budget issues and concerns. They're not responsible for the cleanup of the site, but as far as their involvement. So I keep talking about the record. All this stuff is documented. Where is it documented, and what the heck does that mean? So CERCLA establishes what's called the administrative record. It requires establishment of these administrative records. There's an administrative record for each Superfund site. President will base the selection of a response action. If I can explain what that means. Administrative record, or DAR, contains those documents which form the basis of the selection of the response action. That's kind of redundant with this up here. So basically, those documents I talked about, the proposed plan, the record of decision, the feasibility study, the remedial investigations, the design documents after that, all of that stuff goes into what's called the administrative record. If anyone from the public wants to understand why maybe they come along late, or why did they decide to use XYZ technology or excavate a particular area, or cover it, perhaps. They decided to cover this area and not completely remove it. Those decisions, those documents, those evaluations, those agreements are all sent to the administrative record. So it tells the story of those decisions, everything that fed into, once April retires, there will be things in the administrative record that, where she has worked with her counterparts and with her contractors and her staff that explain why a particular decision was made and how things are moving forward. So the administrative record has all of that for each and every superfund. We have an administrative record for our superfund site. We don't confuse that. The other superfund sites have their own administrative records. And the record is broken up into different areas. So if we have a remedial action, you don't have to search through the whole thing. You can focus in on that remedial action prior to the decision, after the decision, et cetera. So there's organization to it. That's what the judicial review is. It's what I'm saying as well. And it acts as a vehicle for public participation in selecting response actions. So the proposal is all that. The administrative record for the Paducah site can be found on the Environmental Information Center. But about that.
That's our office.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the website. You can go on. It's searchable. So if you need help with it, there's contact information. But that administrative record is extremely important. And last but not least, again, FFA. Now you know what the FFA is. The agreement between the three parties requires that those agencies designate those certain individuals as the appointed FFA project managers for implementation. Again, April Lab, Victor Weeks, April Webb. So let me ask a question. So in Western Kentucky, anybody know, not our current and former Kentucky both regulators, but does anybody know how many Superfund sites we have in Western Kentucky or what they are? So we've got the DOE site. There are 2 sites in Calvert City, and then there's the former tire factory in Mayfield. Those are the only federal Superfund sites. Any questions?
I have a question. You go back a slide.
Okay. On the administrative record?
Now, up at the top in number 1,
Yes.
administrative record on which the president shall base. How does the president,
So that's,
fit into that, or who makes that selection?
so this is verbiage from EPA guidance. If you read a lot of those different acts, the regulations that come from them and the different parts of EPA, the different programs, the regulations, it's kind of like the Bible, the regulations read differently. Some are very straightforward, some are kind of, well, that's a little gray, fuzzy area. Some of them are worded differently. If essentially, there's a lot of times it will say the administrator shall, like the EPA administrator, the administrator shall, the administrator shall. Essentially, that is delegated or flowed down to the appropriate office or the people that are making those decisions. So it essentially, in this case, it would flow, the president would say, hey, EPA administrator, you're responsible for this. I'm not the one who signs off on these things. And then that would go to the regional administrators, including Atlanta Region 4. Eventually, they're looking at Victor to uphold this or make sure that we're in compliance with them.
Thank you.
I had a question about the public participation. Is that a broad or is that regional? Is there a limit to that around the site or?
So it's more local. So for example, we will publish a notice of different things, but like one of those proposed plans, when we make that public notification, we're required to do it in a local, well-circulated newspaper. So of course we would go to the Paducah sign and have it published there. We publish things periodically. A lot of times when we do that, we will typically, we finish the 5-year review, which is one of our review documents. When we started and when we finished the 5-year review, we published public notices in the Paducah Sun and did it in that Saturday, Sunday edition, thinking it would get more circulation. Does that answer the question? When, on the water policy, we have an annual notification or kind of a status of the program that we send out. It's called the mailer. Mailer out, or that annual notification. It goes to all of the residents within around the plant in what we call the water policy box. And then it also goes to local, county, state representatives, not representatives lowercase r, like the judge executive, people like that.
I think too, though, it could be bigger, like, some of the different groups like the Sierra Club, there may be something that they're really interested in. And then you could get comment from an organization like that, right? Where they have strong feelings about particular whatevers. So, while most of it is probably more local, it is public, and so those bigger organizations and things like that, could, say, follow it and then, comment and whatnot, based on how they feel, so.
You've seen, maybe seen, several people have probably seen in the news recently over the last couple of years, some of the things that public are involved in St. Louis and the Treasure Act program. It's the acronym, but it's another cleanup program. It's not CERCLA, but it's a cleanup program of one of the radioactive sites that were used as part of the Manhattan Project. And things were disposed in a sanitary landfill. There was a fire in the landfill. There's been Cold Water Creek, if you've heard of that. And that's part of the public participation. Some lawsuits too, but all of that's made available. They have their own administrative record.
What other questions do you guys have? I realize no project is the same, but if you had to guess, maybe we'll do a couple. Like an easy project and one of these more complicated decisions. From scoping all the way through RIFIS, proposed plan to a ROD, what's the time frame for them? Sorry, I realize it's, so if everything goes really well.
So let me, without giving you a quantitative response, let me try to explain it a little bit. So there was a slide in here about timelines, et cetera. We also have other timelines in there. So if you were to look at our Gantt chart of our schedules, you would see that when we prepare a draft document, typically, unless it's something larger like an RIFS, but typically once DOE sends the draft regulators typically have 30 calendar days to review it. DOE would have 30 days, generally speaking, to resolve those comments, revise it, get it back out the door for another 30-day review approval. And typically what we do with our, I have to get my hands to talk. If you look at how those Gantt bars are stacked, we will bunch those up to the extent possible. We have to consider the resources of the agencies who are doing the reviews as well as the resources that are pulling things together. You don't want to get a cart before a horse situation, but we will accelerate those to the extent possible and try to. I mean, I've never been on a project out here where we literally went by the time frames that we could lay out. They were always accelerated. Some degree we're deciding to make a decision or evaluate something, we would move it forward.
But still looking at several months to potentially handful of years.
Yes, to go through the necessary and prescribed process. One thing I didn't say, part of this process in the administrative record as well is essentially DOE or the community or whoever's doing it, but it's for them to justify, not only to DOE, but for them to justify to the American public, the taxpayer, that a particular cleanup is necessary and what the appropriate level or magnitude of the cleanup is. So April, so what it does in this is an unrealistic situation, but if April said, there's a pile of dirt out there that's been there for years, and it was there when the plant was built, I don't like it there, it just looks bad, we need to clean that up, we need to get it out of here. She really doesn't have the authority to do that as a cleanup. DOE, as well as the regulators, DOE has to go through that process to show that there's a risk and there's a need to do the cleanup. The bigger the cleanup is, the scale, there are magnitudes, but I don't know what the level is. Victor could tell it, but like a cleanup that costs over a certain magnitude, that doesn't just go to Region 4, that actually has to go to DOE headquarters, has to go to EPA headquarters for review so that they can review it and make sure that the DOE, the regulated entity, is making an appropriate decision. And they're not trying to, they're not buying Ferraris to.
Yeah, the threshold for that is $100 million plus project.
So that's part of what this process is to make sure that the federal government agencies are spending money appropriately.
Which is a good thing, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, even April and Bud, we're all taxpayers. Victor and April are taxpayers, so, we all have a stake in it from that perspective. Then we have our professional as well.
So with all the projects that are going on at the site, are they all separate projects?
No. There are, without getting into too much detail. So for example, when y'all were talking about the converters before, it's the 333 building. That's where they're pulling the converters out right now. And they're putting them in boxes and putting them in long-term storage. That is more AEA authority. That is not being performed under circle at this point. We have our permit required activities. So, for example, there's a creek over here, and one of our surface water discharge ditches that we sample regularly, we had a total suspended solids exceedance. And what that means is that after a rainfall event, we had essentially too much suspended material in that sample. And we failed it. Well, as we investigated why that had happened, it happened several months ago. We were good. We had another failure. That's under the Clean Water Act, and we have what's called a KPDES, Kentucky Permanent Discharge Elimination System, KPDES permit for those water discharges. And as we inspected, trying to figure out, okay, where is that sediment coming from? Because we've got to find a way to control it. We discovered that there was what's called an oil control dam, but it had eroded. It's around the pipe. You had to get in the right area to see what it was. So when we were getting heavy rainfall, we suspect that it was eroding around that pipe, and that was causing the TSS exceeds downstream of it at the compliance point. So what we did is, and this was not a circling, we removed that oil control dam and retrofitted it with some rock and rebuilt it essentially. And so far we've been successful with that. We haven't had any issues. So there are things that are occurring at the site. There's other just routine maintenance activities like work on roads and parking lots and utilities and things like that, trying to, that the plant is no longer operating as a gas-age diffusion plant, trying to kind of right-size the utilities for the work that is being performed. And then I think you're familiar where a lot of these heavy duty power lines used to come into these switch yards to power the massive electrical motors in these facilities. Those are shut down. So there's still electricity requirements, but so those types of activities, it's not really a cleanup, but as we get into those utility type activities, if there's contamination, radioactivity, et cetera, then there's a little bit of a cleanup involved, but that's not CERCLA or super fun. That answer.
So I would think, and Bruce, April, you guys feel free to jump in and correct me, or Victor, big takeaways for you guys on this is one, as April has talked about, decision 2029, and instead of going through this process 50 some odd times for 50 different decisions, they're kind of bundling things, they're going to do it 5 times in packages, right? So you see that there's a reason that they're excited about this efficiency they've been able to create, right? So while these are, I think fair to say, bigger decisions because you're bundling stuff together and it might take a little longer to work through it, you are still eliminating repeating this process 49 other times or whatever the right number is, right? Like, so there's some headway definitely because that. The other thing is we're talking about specifically leading into this, potentially citing a waste cell on Paducah, tear down the buildings, have some place to put the rubble and the waste, and take up landfills and plumes and potentially put that in there. As they go through the CERCLA decision for that, which is what we'll start pulling together a group that's going to dig in deeper on. You know, we're kind of early in the process, kind of building the RIFIS, is that right? Which is where they're looking for early input, so that the more we can kind of shape this out is earlier in the process when we get to the proposed plan, we already know what it's going to look like, right? So that's kind of what we want you to take away from this, is to see that in those 2 big groupings, this is anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, that's a good point. So as we go through this process, the whole decision 2029, as we go after those 3 major records of decisions that are site-wide rather than a burial ground or a contaminated soil area or a groundwater plume, as we bundle those together in appropriate grouping, like Eric said, we already have a lot of investigation information across the site, so all of that will feed into those investigations and especially the decisions. Right? It's just a much more efficient approach than where we have been for the last couple of decades. And that's come about. I mean, there were reasons that we were looking at it that way. There was budget limitations. But Portsmouth has shown that they can bundle these things into these 3 major groupings, and once if we can get it on site CERCLA cell, there's a significant cost savings there, and it increases the efficiency of the disposal of the debris and the contaminated soil. And you'll hear a lot more about that.
Hey, Victor, April Webb, anything you guys want to add to this from your perspective?
Well, I guess just the one nuance is that, like, the disposal facility and maybe some facilities that would support that are going to be capital asset projects, and I guess the D&D of the buildings as well. So April may want to talk about how those projects are funded. It's a separate thing from the normal budget process.
Thank you.
Yeah, so daily order 413.3B is our guidance on capital asset projects because of the dollar threshold value of the particular project. In particular for demolition, if it's above 50 million, it has to be under the scrutiny of that order, which requires some additional cost reporting, a big level of effort up front through the process. So you have to go through, he mentioned the CD process, critical design process, to establish the mission need. You know, you have to do the front end planning and essentially set up those steps with the 413 process marries to the CERCLA process and where you are in that. So a lot of credit can be taken for whatever stage we're at in the CERCLA process for some of the CD stuff, but the biggest thing is having the baseline, a baseline for the project, your total project cost captured, and reporting, special reporting through a special system that we have to do against, because as Victor mentioned, it is a separate bucket of money, essentially. It's a capital asset line item, so it'll get its own unique ID and tracking from start to finish. And so, you know, it's a very rigorous process, kind of for the very reason, you know, that Bruce is mentioning, and even the threshold for EPA being 100 million, you know, DOE, for demo, it's 50. So, and then also, if a cell is selected, the construction of that would be a capital asset project because the total project cost, it will be so large that it'll fit the requirements to have to be scrutinized to that capital asset process. So.
And I'll add that that's not just a Department of Energy requirement. Now, the DOE order that you mentioned is how DOE implements it. But then capital assets apply to all government agencies. It's higher than just Department of Energy. So if the organizations that are running LBL, most of you have been over there and you've seen the concrete block buildings that are the restaurants with the different campgrounds and stuff like that. I'm not sure what those things cost. That's not a capital asset project. Olmsted Dam, construction of Olmsted Dam from the ground up by the Corps of Engineers, that was a capital asset project. And what it means is that when they're spending that amount of money, the federal government, that agency that's responsible for it, really has some oversight. And like April said, the funding for those projects doesn't just come through the normal channels. Congress actually has to say, okay, we agree to authorize these dollars for this huge project because the federal government is building, constructing. So it's not unique to you. Again, it's a way to protect the taxpayers by the government, essentially.
So a new office building for your capital asset project.
And then how much it costs.
If you get that skyscraper out there, Buzz, it will be a capital asset.
Hey, April Webb, Sonia, anything from Kentucky you guys want to add?
I don't think so.
I
Well,
don't
this
have
was
anything either.
So again, there's a process, lots of regulations to go through. It's not just based on the cost of something or whatever criteria we think are appropriate for it. The process and the public participation is all along the way. Those are, if you didn't get anything else, those are the two takeaways.
Last chance, any questions for Brittany? If you think of any, don't hesitate to shoot. Chris is very responsive. He will answer questions. Maybe he will call you up or something. We'll get it squared away. So, thanks.
Thank you. I hope that helped.
So, April, where do we go from here? So we've got the circlet we all masters of the regulatory process at this point. So
Absolutely. SMEs now.
That's it.
Matter experts.
much higher billable rates.
Yeah. So, kind of the next phases are somewhat up to the cab, do you guys want to go through all of the, deep dive, as a group? Or do you want a subcommittee, or, because we're gonna just keep growing on these types of discussions. And we did mention, preparing for that potential recommendation, maybe April, May, somewhere in there time frame. So, I think we will be wanting to look at another educational and go now to more of some of the details of like citing and some of that criteria, and looking at the different factors and things like that we did touch on a little bit at the previous meeting. But really, that's a choice on, is it everybody, or we can have a small group, however, we want to do it, you guys want to do it. But the main thing is that, we are able to give everyone the information to make the decision or to help guide what the recommendation ends up being. And then, we talked, I think last time we had the recommendation from the previous. So we have that as a starting point, and I'm pretty sure, I think, the next meeting or educational would want to bring in the team that's working on looking at all of these factors and looking at all this. Frank Miller and his group, and they've kind of done here's what was in the previous feasibility study for the waste disposal alternative, and then here's where we are today, and kind of look at the differences and kind of look at some of that. And talk through that and talk through, some of the different key factors associated with those different things. So, yeah, I think that's, we're progressing as we go. We needed to kind of take a step back to kind of cover some bases, and think, this is ultimately what everything's gonna flow up in and through the process. To get to a decision document for the site.
All right, so Ben, in order to get you ready for a potential recommendation on this, you being the board, couple things. One, I would rather lay out a plan that's set to provide you too much information. You say, hey, let's back off a little bit, and that's not to give you an output to get to the end, and you say, I wish we did more, right? So probably look like we're gonna load you heavy, and then I think we need to back off, at least for planning purposes, right? So we're looking at everything from how to build a waste cell to where you put a waste cell, what goes, how do you know what to say, what does Bruce look at, and what are the mechanisms, why is this a engineered landfill and not a dump, right? Everything, so that you understand, and if you run into somebody at Walmart and they say, Ben, is this a good idea? You can go, yeah, pretty comfortable, right? So that's kind of our plan where we want to get to. And so I think that what we've kind of mapped out is meeting for about an hour at a time, because that seems to be about the limit. It's not asking, sneak away from work or family for too long. Plus, after about an hour, if we're doing well, we've covered about all your brain's going to take in anyway, right? So 40 minutes of presentation and 20 minutes of questions, kind of what we're thinking about. Probably a couple times a month, starting in January, February, March, possibly the 1st of April, and be able to start having that discussion is kind of, at least initially, what I'm thinking, right? And if we want to tweak it, we can. So the question I think for you guys is, and then however you guys want to have this discussion, is, does that, at least as an initial plan, work for you? And we can tweak it. As we get closer, we'll bring you guys in and let you help kind of map it out. And 2, do you want to do it as a full board? Do you want to create a little subcommittee? we can do it either way. Or what's your preference of how you want to handle it? But it is a fairly significant decision. And yeah, if you're like, hey, that's more time than I want to put in on it, and I trust the group, that's okay. If it's something where you want to go, no, I need to be in this and I want to get my hands dirty, then that's okay too. So we want to meet you wherever you are, right? So I'm gonna be quiet about that.
Well, and the subcommittee is just doing the deeper dive, but
Yes.
still the full committee is who gives the recommendation.
Yes, and Haley is working on a plan to pull together all information that's given to the group to share with everybody, both the board and the new members, so everyone will get all the information. You'll get the presentations, the handouts, the copies of the summaries. You'll get Q&As. If there's a bunch of questions we ask, Bruce or Frank, and they have to come back and give us answers, like, you'll have it. So if you're here, that's fantastic. If you're not, you'll still have access that you can kind of keep up with it as we go.
Yeah. So I guess the first decision is kind of, do we want the full board? Do we want a subcommittee? And then if we decide on subcommittee, then we'll say, well, who wants to be a part of the subcommittee? So I guess we want to start that discussion with, does everyone want to be involved, or would we prefer to have a subcommittee that's doing the deeper dive into the information and bringing back kind of their summary back to the full board? Any thoughts?
Would it be an additional, like, once a month? So I mean, once a month. Right, so there should be one additional in that month, or would this be two additional?
Part of that's going to depend on what you guys do. Like we can meet as frequently as you want, and if you get into it, you need more, we can do more. But I want to make sure you have all the information. So,
So if we do it as an open thing, then we can come and go as we're pleased. If you do a subcommittee, you're really committing to. Because we're gonna have to depend on the subcommittee.
yes, that's probably a good way of putting it.
And, and some of you might have that time to do it, but if you're gonna, about additional meetings, like for me, I'd rather be able to say, yes, I can make it today, rather than try to say, I'm gonna be on a subcommittee and it's gonna conflict.
Okay, that's fair.
For me.
No, we totally understand you are volunteers to put time in with work and church and family and other activities, and we are blessed with people that are really involved in the community. And I don't get you for 40 hours a week. Like, that's just the reality of it. And that's what you try. I try so hard. So
I just don't want volunteer paid up.
But if you would like for us to go ahead, and we can open this to everybody and just say, if you can make it, that's great. If the time fits, you want to stick your head in, and if it's not a good week, if it doesn't work and you can't, then honestly, no hard feelings. Like, we will find a way to get you the information and kind of go from there. If that's what's best for you guys. Like, we will, and if we need to close your ears, April, if we need to do the same session a couple times, like say, hey, we can do it, whatever. Repeat it, do one midday, one in the afternoon. We can figure something else out. We got options. You tell us what you need, and we'll go.
I'm gonna be there.
You're gonna be there. I had a feeling.
Yeah. She's all in. I'm all in. Look at that. Bruce is so lucky.
My plan would be to be there, but I also know schedule. Rodney and I were
Right.
talking about his schedule. I understand that. But I also, and this puts a lot of pressure back on Haley, because, again, as she sends out the information, for instance, today, one of the things that I did was I scanned it ahead of time. So I thought, okay, I need to ask this question. And so I think by having, if that stuff can come out a day ahead, that meeting, then Rodney can look at it and say, oh, I can't make the meeting, but I got this question. Then he can go ahead and feed that question, and that can become a part of the discussion that becomes reported. So he gets his answer, we get his concern taken care of.
Okay.
So I like that option.
Sure.
David, I'm sorry to give you more work there.
It's okay, John, that's what I count on you for.
I roll off in June, so you.
So, Eric, don't, but
Not just CAD members can be on this.
Absolutely. Like Molly, darling, we would, actually, I really hope you guys, because the worst thing we could do is go through this process and Ben's ready to do a recommendation in April, May timeframe, and something slips, and all of a sudden we get all of our new board members on, and there's 6 in the package, and then like you guys are like, I don't know what you're talking about, right? And it's a big, and it's not fair to you, and so we want to include you in this. And preferably not setting back, but at the table for these. So you're asking questions and getting engaged.
So will the subcommittee be making a recommendation to the larger board for an overall? Because I know, in my experience, that's been the case of a subcommittee, right?
So the subcommittee will kind of draft the recommendation that comes in, right? So like the way the Federal Advisory Committee acts is the subcommittee can take no action on its own. Right, so any of you from the subcommittee could write a and honestly, if you think one way and Ben thinks another, and each one write separate recommendations, we can bring them both forward and we can argue them out. And hopefully we don't get arm wrestled for it, right? But ideally, you guys will come to some common ground and we'll be able to roll it forward and kind of go that way. So, and then like a lot of this stuff, if you guys tell us what you want it to look like, what you're thinking about, we can help craft and pull it together. Get with the DOE folks to make sure that our verbiage is right, they understand what you're saying, and that we're clear in our delivery. So there's no confusion. That answer your question? Yes. I mean, all right, so what do you guys think?
Is there anybody on the board who would like to say, hey, I don't want to add time, like I'm not, like, I support you guys, even if it's all, I can't make extra meetings. I just want to give people an opportunity.
And that's okay. Yeah. That is perfectly okay. I give you the
Yeah, I'd like to as I can, but like, well, so it's been tough, so it's, you already fit, but like, if I'm not, yeah, I want to do it.
Thank you.
We're thinking sort of an open meeting, and then you'll just kind of
We'll do that. We'll sit down with Buzz in April and Ben and Gay coordinate kind of schedules, which should work. Get that schedule out to you guys as soon as we can. We will also, with April's permission, try to get presentations and information that's going to be shared with you early so we can share it so you can preview and then kind of go from there. So then if you couldn't be here, if you do have questions or maybe just need clarification on something that you see, we can get that for you. And then any information pulled together, shared, discussion, summary, Haley's going to pull it together and we're creating kind of a growing PDF binder so that by the end you'll have all the documents in one place and just be able to send it to you. She's got some fancy tools she's working on to make that slick and nice. Yeah, so.
Now, I know coming from the University of Life,
Yep.
you know, you have boards, if you have so many people there, then it's a quorum, and there's issues there. Is there anything we're running into with that?
There is, and we will, that's a me problem, quite honestly. So what I'm gonna try to do, and I think Buzz is on board with that, is that we keep these at an educational session level, so that gives us some flexibility so that we're not having to have public comment, we're not having to have federal notices and all this. We're just giving you guys information to get you ready for something else, which is perfectly legal. And then when you're ready to start discussing recommendations, then we'll have to kind of change our tack a little bit.
But that would be at a regular meeting, yeah.
Yep.
Yep. So that'll help you have the quorum and everything.
Right. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so what we kind of discussed is like if the group meets offline for this education sessions with April and Frank and holy cow, what's her name?
Price.
Karen Price, thank you. And then we will come back at the next full board meeting and we're quote unquote public. And we'll have the summaries and let you guys talk about what we discussed at that meeting for anyone who wasn't there. Plus it kind of puts it on the record, right? So it's kind of an education session collectively. And then if you want to start building like your recommendation stuff there, that would be good. That keeps us above board and all.
Is there a timeline that we think that this will follow, like the expectation is we'll have? Maybe be prepared for a recommendation by May, or is this kind of,
May's kind of the target. So we're thinking if we can get comfortable with this discussion, start having thoughts pulled together, looking at the April, May timeline to start having something ready to vote on. Like that's kind of our plan, and we can go from there. Think that's okay? Yes, right now that's the plan. That's the plan.
And for folks not on the cab or guests, how would they get on the list for the education session?
They're on. Yeah, they get everything now. Like, so it's, we worked with Buzz in April and they everything you get, they get already. So it's, we're treating them as though they're on the board. It's gonna stink when we call Marshall and say, hey, listen. I should have told us about like smuggling.
Bring break 2021, came back.
Nesting dolls. Yeah. Who knows? But it'll be, yeah, we're good. Like, it's good. What other questions do you guys have?
Hey, Eric, this is Victor Weeks.
Hey, man.
I wasn't involved at the time, but I did go back and look at kind of DOE's response to the original CAB comments on when they put forward this concept. And there was all kinds of commitments DOE made. They were fairly specific in terms of what they would do. Different, I don't know if it was exhibits that they would produce, but that might be something y'all could look at and DOE could look at and say, okay, is this still the commitment, or is there other things that y'all need? Something to look at anyway, at least based on my review of that.
Thank you, Victor. That's a really good idea. We have discussed that some of those previous CAB recommendations, there were several groups that put in a lot of time, and Ben's kind of raised the point that we should probably engage those folks just to understand where they were coming from. So that's one of the things I think we're going to do is invite some of them to one of the sessions, just so you can ask questions of them and understand what their thought process was when they made previous recommendations, because it's, well,
I'm sorry, I was mainly focused on the commitments DOE made in its response. It said it was going to do several things to continue to inform the board as the project moved forward before it was derailed or whatever. But maybe I'm misremembering, but there were several things they said they would do or produce to help the board as it went forward.
I will pull that list and get with Buzz in April.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Other questions, thoughts, comments on this as we're? Any members of the public have comment they would like to share at this point? No? Okay, Zach, giving you your chance. All right, we're final comments from the board. Anything from you guys on anything in particular? You have a presentation.
I do have a presentation.
You do. So, see how smooth we are? We tried this all week.
We do have something from Mr. Don.
So it's been a long-standing tradition that as you term out, typically you term out as chair. We have not had anybody that's like not been chair at their last meeting, right? So this is the first time in a long time. And so
Gavel.
we are giving Don the gavel he reigned with terror over the years. I'm just kidding.
He'll join another gavel.
So it is one of the great things we do is
Thank you.
Don, as chair, you have traveled across the country and represented us on phone calls and meetings and meetings around town.
They said 23,000 miles.
Crazy, wow, crazy. So, lots of time, lots of effort, reading documents for us. signing off on minutes for Haley, and thank you for what you did and the example and leadership you provide.
So that's been very much my thing. And I have to give really credit to my wife, who served 6 years, and when she was ready to roll off, I approached Buzz and says, if possible, because I didn't know the rules, if when she rolls off, I would like to be a part of CAB, because I spent so much time with CAB already.
You got a confirmation number right there on the spot.
So, yes, it's, for both of us, it's been a tremendous opportunity to learn. You know, having moved here in retirement, we knew nothing about the plant. You know, that wasn't, even when we bought a house, we didn't know about the plant and its history, so we know now. And we're just glad to be a part of that history. So thank you.
Thank you. Any other, any comments from you on anything? Guys, thank you. If we don't talk to you in the next couple of days, I hope you have a safe and joyous Thanksgiving. You can spend time with loved ones, family, friends, whoever they might be. And if you don't have anyone to spend Thanksgiving with, we've got an extra seat in my house. Come over anytime. We will be eating at least 4 times, I have been told. So at any point, show up and there'll be somebody at the table. Thank you for what you guys do for the community. A blessing to me. Haley. So thank you all very much. All right, Chair.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you, guys.